Let's look at some properties of radical expressions. Radical expressions are just things with like square root or cube root or fourth root, those kind of things. One thing that we sometimes forget to do is to realize what all the square roots of the number are. If you were just to say, what's the square root of 25? I think a lot of you would say 5. But the way I've worded this question helps you to think, what are all the square roots of 25? In other words, what times itself could equal 25 besides 5? And it has to be something times itself. Well, you may say, well, nothing. I mean, I can think of 1 times 25 and 5 times 5 and maybe some fractions times each other or something. But actually, if you think about it, negative 5 times negative 5 also gives you 25. So what happens with square roots, or really any even root, and what I mean by even is the index of a square root isn't understood to be 2, and the index of a fourth root or a sixth root, those things are all even roots. So on even roots, there are always 2 that really come out of it if they don't specify whether they want the positive or the negative one. If they just say, what are all the square roots of 25, you actually have to say 5 and negative 5 are both answers. So what I do as a trick for that, just to kind of help you remember, if they use the words square root and they don't put a symbol on it, and you're the one that's going to put a symbol on it to figure it out, anytime you write the radical sign that's an even index, always put a plus or minus sign in front of it to remind you that we're not just going to find the positive version of square root of 25, but we're also going to find the negative version as well. That way, when you say that the square root of 25 is 5, you'll remember to write the plus or minus in front of it, and that plus or minus sign just means that there's 2 answers that look like 5 and negative 5. So anytime you're writing the radical sign, you also need to write the plus or minus sign in front. Now, if the radical sign is already there, you don't write the plus or minus, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what are all the square roots of negative 25? Well, if we put a square root on negative 25, that's fine. Just make sure you put the plus or minus with it. So don't ever put a radical sign on something yourself without putting the plus or minus in front. And so what that means is, if you remember, square root of a negative is like, you could split that apart and put a positive 25 times a negative 1. And that would mean the same thing as the square root of negative 25. And then this, by definition, is, we named it the letter I all the time. And then this one is a 5. So we know just at face value that it's probably going to be 5i, but because of that plus or minus sign, we actually have 2 answers, a positive 5i and a negative 5i. So we'll just leave it like that. And that is our answer for what are all the square roots of negative 25. It's both positive 5i and negative 5i. Because just think about it, if you took 5i times itself, which is what squaring is, then you would get positive 25i squared. Well, I squared by definition is negative 1, so you'd have 25 times negative 1, which would be negative 25. So that just shows that negative 5i squared also gives you negative 25, besides just the 5i squared, which also gives you negative 25. So there's 2 answers to these square root problems, or really any even root. When they say what are the square roots, there's really more than just the obvious one. There's also the negative one. Now on the page before, it had it in words, what are the square roots of 25? But there's a very subtle difference here, and you've got to realize what the difference is. On this page, we're not saying it in words, what are all the square roots of 25. It's just having the radical on it already, and it just says square root of 25. Well, this assumes automatically, because they already have the radical sign on the 25, that they only prefer the positive version. And so this one, the only answer would be 5. The only difference between this page and the last page is that the last page you wrote the radical sign on, so you have to remember to write the plus or minus. This one, if they already have the radical sign on a number, they only mean the positive version of square root of 25, and on this one, they mean only the negative version of square root of 49. So this one would be negative 7. So you assume when they've already written the radical that if they want the negative one, they'll put a negative in front. If they don't want the negative one, they won't. Another way this distinction could come up is something like this. What if we were asked to solve for x, and it says x squared equals 49? You may know that that would be 7, but it also could be negative 7. And so the one way I think about that, to go back to the rule on the previous page, is to get rid of the squared. Technically you can square root this side, but then you have to square root the other side to balance it out. It's just an algebraic equation step that if you square root one side, you got to square root the other side. So notice we just added a square root symbol or a radical symbol to the 49 that wasn't there previously. And so when we're the one that writes the square root symbol in, we have to always remember to write the plus or minus sign in front. And so what happens here is the square and the square root cancel each other out, which just leaves an x. And then we write plus or minus, and then the square root of 49 is 7. And so that helps us to remember to get both the positive version and the negative version of 7. So remember, when you are the one that writes the radical sign, then you've got to remember to write the plus or minus sign with it, and that way you won't forget to get both answers. However, if the radical sign is already in the original problem, then you assume a positive square root unless they put a negative in front, and here you would assume a positive square root because they did not put a negative in front. Lastly, let's look at odd indexes. An odd index is something like that, where it means what cubed would give me 8, or what to the third power would give me 8. And the answer to this question is 2. So let's look at, does it make any difference on the positive and negative things? So let's look here. We have, what if they use the words, what are all the cube roots of 8? You would be the one writing in the radical symbol, and you do not need to put a plus or minus. It would actually be wrong if you put a plus or minus on an odd index. The reason is because if you think about 2 times 2 times 2 versus negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Well, 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, and 3 negatives actually keep it negative, and so it's negative 8. Whereas when we did evens, you got a positive 4 this way, and you could also get a positive 4 this way. And so that's just an example of why the even and odd thing is different, because this one, you're going to get a positive when you do positive numbers times each other, and there's an odd number of them. And when you do negatives, there's going to be a negative answer only when you do the negative ones times each other an odd number of times. So because of that, when they say what are all the cube roots of 8, the cube roots, the only cube root of 8 is positive 2. And so it wouldn't matter if they wrote it in words and we wrote the radical symbol in there, or if the radical symbol was already in there, the answer is going to be 2 either way. However, when it's the cube root of negative 8, and if that was the question, it wouldn't matter if it was in words, what are the cube roots of negative 8, or if it already had a radical on it, like this one. Whether you write it or they write it, there's only one answer to these questions, and it is negative 2 in this case, because that's the only way you're going to have something times something times something that gives you negative 8. And so negative 2 is the only answer. So you don't have to worry about the plus or minus sign in front. of anything, whether you write the radical or they write the radical when it comes to odd index.